tragic story. A premature death is the usual reason for a ghost, and Oxford's had more than its fair share of death and destruction through the centuries. I would say there are three main events in the history of Oxford that have led to most ghosts. One is unique to Oxford, one really only happened in Oxford. Well, certainly as far as Britain is concerned, it only happened in Oxford. The other two events happened throughout Britain, but Oxford was at the centre of things. And these three events in chronological order are the town and gown violence. Now this is unique to Oxford, although it did happen in other European cities, I'm told. Oh, I lost the button. No, what have I lost?
Top.
Oh, that. All right, thank you. It's a good start, isn't it? All right. Yeah. So the town and gown violence. I don't, if any of you have done any tours of Oxford, you know anything of the history of Oxford, you're probably aware of this. But when the students first came to Oxford in the 12th century, many of the townspeople here absolutely hated them. Can't imagine why, mind you. But anyway, the students here were absolutely hated by townspeople. The town, by the way, of Oxford is much older than the university. We're going to see a Norman church on this tour. Oxford also has a Saxon church. It's not as old as many English towns though. There were no Roman settlers in Oxford. Oxford is a Saxon town, so it's about 1200 years old. Students came here 300 or 400 years after the people first came here. And as I said, many of the people really resented the students, and there was all kinds of terrible violence, particularly in the early days of the university. One incident, for example, in 1255, over an unpaid bill in a local tavern, led to over 60 students being killed. There was a 3-day period of rioting, most of it on the high street where we're going to see, and yeah, over 60 students were left for dead. Mind you, I have also read as few as 6 being killed, but on a ghost tour, of course, we go with the highest figure I read, in fact even so higher than that sometimes. But I think I actually read 65 once. History books never agree on anything, by the way. But anyway, so let's say up to 65 students were killed in just one incident, and there were many. If any of you are students here right now, I just want to reassure you, the last student to be killed by a townsperson was over 100 years ago. Throughout the 20th century, no student was killed by a townsperson, so you're probably going to be safe right now. But until 100 years ago, there were many incidents of violence between the town and the gown, and all kinds of students were being killed through the centuries here in Oxford. Anyway, I'll go into a bit more gruesome detail when we get to the relevant spots. And that is unique to Oxford. I actually had someone on the tour from Bologna the other day, which is, I believe, the oldest university in Europe, probably in the world actually, Bologna, and well, let's say Europe anyway, and he said the same thing happened there. He said the townspeople in Bologna really had a problem with the students, and there were terrible incidents of violence. So I really don't know what it is about students that people find so objectionable, but anyway, there obviously was something objectionable about students in the early days, or the townspeople felt so. Alright, that's the first thing. The second event is the Reformation, when England was moving between Catholicism and Protestantism, and back to Catholicism, and then finally Protestantism. If you supported the wrong religion at the wrong time, then you were in trouble. And particularly during the reign of Bloody Mary, who certainly lived up to her name, during her reign nearly 300 Protestants were burned just for being Protestants. And the first place I'm going to show you is the site where the 3 most prominent Protestants, Cranmer, Latimer and Ridley, were burnt here in Oxford, and you can hear their screams. Anyway, I'll talk about that when we get there. But that's the Reformation, and that's in the 16th century, by the way. Middle of the 16th century was the worst period of that. And then the final, and probably the incident which has led to more ghosts than any other in Oxford, and that is the English Civil War, which was fought here during the 1640s, and Oxford was the capital of England, the royal capital of England during the English Civil War. Charles I moved his royal court from London to Oxford. Oxford at that time was a walled city. In fact, we are just standing outside the original city walls. We will spend most of the tour within the city walls, not surprisingly, which is the oldest part of Oxford, but we are actually outside the city walls right now. And during the Civil War, the walls were fortified or refortified. There was all kinds of fighting in and around Oxford during the English Civil War, as you can imagine, with the war going on. Lots of death going on at that time. So there are many Civil War ghosts here in Oxford, which I will be mentioning on the tour. But before we go and see where the bishops were burnt, I must mention the chapel of Trinity College here, where they've just had a wedding. I hope it went well, because it's very haunted. By the way, this has absolutely nothing to do with anything I've just told you. And there's a good reason for that, because we're outside the old city. None of these buildings were built until after the Civil War. And in fact, the chapel here at Trinity is a late 17th century chapel. So it was one of the first buildings to be built on this side of the street. And it is haunted by a 20th century ghost, a very recent ghost, a particularly scary ghost, in fact. Almost all the ghosts I'm going to talk about tonight aren't particularly scary. I mean, if you see one tonight, you're going to be a little bit afraid. Well,
people in costume, I think.
It's going to be a little bit hard. But there's really nothing to be afraid of when you see a ghost. They just walk perhaps calmly past you. Sometimes they might even walk right through you. But really, there's not much interaction between ghosts and human beings. This one is the exception, though. The ghost of Trinity College Chapel is particularly dangerous. One incident happened here in 1966. The college organist was practicing one evening. It was probably about this time of the evening. It would have been dark, though it was the winter, and you would hear the organ right now if somebody was playing it. And all of a sudden, the organist just collapsed on top of the keyboard. Now we know he did this because there was this mighty din, like bah, you know. He literally fell on top of the keyboard, having suffered a massive heart attack. This was a young man. The organists here in these colleges are students. He was a young man. He had no history of heart disease, but it was a massive heart attack which has caused his death. And the look on his face apparently was one of absolute horror. Looked as if he'd in fact seen a ghost. No real explanation though at the time, until a few years later the college chaplain, not the current chaplain, the one before the current chaplain, was in the chapel alone at night, and he saw a ghost-like figure which he described as a phantom, and he recognised it. It was a female-shaped phantom, female face, and it really scared him. His heart was beating pretty fast, but he didn't die. I mean, he was able to leave the chapel without any major ill effects to his health. And but it bugged him because he recognised the face. So he was going through his photo albums and he saw a photograph of his mother, which he didn't know. He died when he was very young. And he thought, oh my goodness, that phantom resembled my mother. And there is no reason why his mother will haunt this hotel. Every other ghost story I'm going to tell you about, there is a good reason behind it. This one, well, certainly his mother would not haunt this hotel. What we think, and it's a theory, it's not for sure, what we think is the Phantom of Trinity College is one of those incredibly rare but very scary ghosts which seems to go out of its way to cause most fear by perhaps taking on a shape from your past. It only seems to haunt people that make regular appearances here, the organist, the chaplain, people perhaps it gets to know and doesn't want them in the chapel, particularly at night when it feels like it wants to be alone inside the chapel. And in fact, because of these incidents, no one will practice alone in that chapel at night. No one. In fact, I'm amazed they're still having a wedding here. I guess they've actually emptied the chapel out right now. Students, the current organist, the current chaplain, nobody will be alone in that chapel. This phantom has actually achieved what it intended to achieve. It has scared the out of people, and as I said, that's my theory anyway. It was able to get to know the chaplain. It knew perhaps of his past and that his mother died very young, was able to sort of take on the image of his dead mother to cause the chaplain most fear. And I suspect something very similar happened to the organist. He saw the phantom and it totally freaked him out, and it caused him a massive heart attack. So anyway, the most haunted chapel. I will show you the most haunted hotel later. This is the most haunted college chapel. Good luck trying to get in here, by the way, if you're desperate to be scared. It's pretty hard to get past the porter at night time, but this would be the place to go if you want to be most scared in a college chapel. But I'm going to show you plenty of other scary places as well that you can get to without having to hassle the porters.